Of a person who wanted to undo the injustice, the terrible injustice and oppression. But to do that, you had to purify your motives. You were constantly working excruciatingly on your inside, on your heart, and purifying the motives, purifying the tactics. And so my question is that because he was so public and he would do acts of civil disobedience that were very risky and very confrontational, but he had a way that people said that even adversaries didn't feel threatened in his presence. But how assertive can we be in public? How assertive can we be with our civil disobedience? He did say he was an experimenter of truth. So that means that there's a lot of options here. There's no one way to do it. And so how assertive can we be? Is destruction of property nonviolent in his view? Or how assertive can we be? Could it be symbolic? Also with the secrecy, he said truth hates secrecy, but he kept his salt march a secret. He walked the salt march, but people didn't know where he was ultimately going and why he was doing it until the end. So there was some secrecy there. So how much leeway does the Gandhian methods have with this idea of secrecy and assertiveness with our civil disobedience?
Secrecy was something that he didn't like. He said nothing should be secret in public life. People should be aware of it. I don't think that the Salt March, there was anything really secret there. The reason why he didn't announce the route he was taking was because he wasn't clear about it himself. He knew he wanted to end up at the sea and manufacture salt there. That was definite. But the route, he wanted to take a route so that he could stop in a village every day and inspire the people there to join the march it's also a question of which village would be able to provide hospitality to so many people. All these people marching with him for 25 days, they had to have some sort of hospitality, food and all that. So he had to find villages that would be able to host such groups of people. And so he didn't know the route. He was doing it every day. And when he landed at one village, then another village would invite him to come there and so on. That's why it was a secret and not open. But about destroying things, he had faced this problem also in 1942 when he launched the Quit India movement against the British. And there were a lot of young people who had joined the movement, and they believed that destroying bridges, blowing up bridges and disrupting the train service and so on, that is non-violent. That we are not killing anybody, we are not harming anybody, and so as long as we can destroy property, that's fine. And grandfather didn't agree with that at all. He said we are destroying property and putting people into inconvenience. And the property that we destroy is made out of the tax money that people pay. And so when you destroy them, the people are going to have to pay more tax money to rebuild the stuff. So it's, in that sense, it is a violent act and it doesn't help the people. Because as I said earlier, the whole concept of his non-violent action was not to treat the British as enemies and hurt them, but to transform them and to gain the sympathy of the people in that whole process. I'd like to share with you one example. In 2004, I was invited to Palestine and Israel to speak on nonviolence there. And I spent a week in each place and spoke a lot about nonviolence, and people came and heard me. And then toward the last day, the day before I was to leave, Yasser Arafat was still alive, and he invited me to his home to have a dialogue. And when I went there, he tells me, he said, you've been here for all this time and you've been speaking about nonviolence. And he said, I want to ask you a simple question. If you were in my place, what would you do? How would you face the Israeli people nonviolently? And I said, well, this is a hypothetical question, so I'll give you a hypothetical answer. I said, before coming to Palestine, I had gone to Amman, Jordan, and I had seen almost 1 million Palestinian refugees living there in horrible conditions. They were miserable because the Jordanian government wouldn't do anything for them. The Palestinian government couldn't do anything for them. So they relied entirely on what the United Nations Refugee Department gave them. And that was just their existence. So they were miserable, and when I stopped to talk to them, all of them expressed one desire. They just wanted to go back to their homeland and live in peace and farm the land and make a living. They didn't have any political ambitions or anything. So I told Yasser Arafat that if I was in your place, I would go there and mobilize the men, women, and children and march them like Gandhi had the South March, without any military protection or armed protection or any armaments at all. Just men, women, and children quietly marching back to their homeland. I said, if you have even 500,000 of them coming, following you, can you imagine the impact you will make internationally? That the whole media all over the world would focus on this march day after day. And it will awaken the conscience of the whole world. And with that exposure, the whole international media there, what would the Israeli people be able to do? Can they crush you? Can they bring their army and shoot innocent men, women, and children in the presence of the media? They wouldn't be able to do that. You would put an immediate break on what they can do in response to this. They may stop you. They may block your way into the country with their military, but they can't shoot you or kill you. So if you face that kind of a blockade, then you just camp there and say, well, we are not going anywhere. We're going to stay here and die here. And that, I said, would focus the whole world's attention on your problem, and you'll gain the world's sympathy, and everything will be fine. But what they are doing in the name of nonviolence today, by throwing stones and burning up property and so on, that's not nonviolence, and nobody is sympathizing with them. They are not gaining world sympathy in their movement. So it's, it defeats the whole purpose. The purpose of a nonviolent struggle is to mobilize the sympathy of the community and the world through your suffering. But when you start breaking up things and destroying things, you turn people off.
If I may, you began, in a sense, challenging us as why are we the Catholic worker? Why do we have a label that might exclude other people? And I just want to say that I believe that is essential, that we define ourselves and who we are We have to be able to work with other people. But we are who we are. The example you give of asking someone to give a penny for a shirt or a nickel for a bowl of soup is an idea that I recoil from with horror. Commodifying the gifts that we're given to give to other people is something that I cannot have any peace with. And the Catholic worker is very, very broad. But if I heard of a Catholic worker house that charged for their clothing room or their soup line, I would think that that was somebody maybe very good, maybe a very good project, but it's outside of what the Catholic worker is. I also believe if we had a peace movement that was like the NRA, that kind of monolithic group, I would be outside of that and I would be opposed to it. I think what we need is ways that we can work together as ourselves. As Peter Moore, one of the founders of the Catholic Workers, said, we need Muslims to be Muslims, we need Christians to be Christians, Jews to be Jews, communists to be communists. I think another example where we differ is, as a Christian, I believe we should love our enemies. I also believe we have enemies. I have enemies, my friends have enemies. How do we love them? To not acknowledge that there are people who mean us harm, to say that they're just friends we haven't met yet, I think is naive and potentially dangerous. But that doesn't mean we can't work together. But the idea of having one monolith that would be one model that for all of us to follow, I think what's going to bring down this empire is not by something like the NRA, which I detest in its form, in its message, in its beliefs. It's going to be many thousands of small movements eroding this, not something that will be as big as the empire, such as the NRA, but something that will be opposed by many very, very different, very creative movements that can find common area where they can work together and be very respectful of the places where they can't. So I think we'll remain the Catholic worker, and
I'm sure, right? I didn't expect to change.
well,
I respect your point of view, and you are welcome to hold that point of view. But my experience and my understanding of my grandfather's work is that what I explained. And so, fine.
I have two questions. I'll make them short. One is the Hindu culture has such a wondrous and brilliant selection of spiritual texts, the Mahabharata, Bhagavad Gita, Upanishads, Ramayana, and many more. But I was wondering if you had any insight into why the Ramayana by Tulsidas was the favorite book of your grandfather. That's my first question. And the second question is, I have never really understood fasting or how to use it, and honestly, nor did I have a desire to. But I realized that your grandfather used fasting very effectively in his work. I was wondering if you might offer some insight into that. And thank you.
Why he liked Ramayana so much was because he appreciated the kind of person Ram was. Was depicted as a very honest, very compassionate, very loving, very respectful person. And he was the ideal of what he wanted to become. And so he used that as a model of what a person should be. And he said, he often told us when we were growing up too, he said, This idea that we are born and we are who we are and we have to live with that is wrong. He said we are people, we ought to be able to change ourselves, and we have to constantly do this every day. And he asked me, he said, I want you, every morning when you get up, you're going to say to yourself that you are going to be a better person today than you were yesterday. And to become a better person today, you have to make a list of all the things that you consider to be your weaknesses, so that you can transform those weaknesses into strengths and become a better human being, which is what he did in his life and what many others did in their life, and they became great people whom we worship today. Nobody was born great. No, even my grandfather wasn't born a great person. He was a scamp when he was young. He had all the weaknesses of any teenager. He ate meat and he stole money and he spoke lies and he did all of the things that any teenager would do. But he grew out of it. He became a better person when he realized that these are weaknesses I can't live with, and this is not what I want to be. So it's a conscious effort that they made, and the conscious effort that each one of us can make every day of our life to become better and better. And when we do that, then we'll be able to resolve a lot of the issues that we have today. Unfortunately, we all live in that myth that I am what I am and I'm just going to live that way. And so we, have all these weaknesses there. But what was the other lesson? I forgot. Fasting. Fasting he used more for spiritual purposes, as a form of meditation. By fasting, he was able to, focus on himself and inner self and try to find his weaknesses and spiritual strength. And then when he reached that charismatic stage, when he became so revered all over the country, he realized that fasting was a weapon that he could use to make people do what he wanted them to do. Like when they had these riots between Hindus and Muslims, he realized that by sacrificing his life, he would be able to stop them from doing this. So, you have to reach that kind of level to be able to have that kind of effect on the society. Today, if I go and fast, nobody would care. They say, let him die if he wants to. But you have...
No, we wouldn't. We want you to stay alive.
Thank you.
Mohandas Gandhi, your grandfather, ran into a disciple on shipboard, ran into a disciple of the American physico-culturist Bernard McFadden. And from him he learned about the American medical reform tradition, which included therapeutic fasting. And he was so excited about it that he contacted the American naturopathic doctor Herbert Shelton and invited him to come to India for 5 years and teach fasting to the Indians. And Herbert Shelton said yes, he'd come for 2 years, but the Second World War intervened and it never occurred, and then there was the partition and so forth. But the big book on fasting that Herbert Shelton wrote was your grandfather put into every Gandhian ashram, from what I'm told. I can tell you a great deal about fasting afterward. If you want to talk with me, it's basically a form of rest, whatever it's used for. And Kathy knows. I see her nodding. at the Catholic Worker, we have a problem. Your grandfather was very ecumenical, and he took ideas. He was incredible about taking ideas wherever he could find them. We have that problem at the Catholic Worker too. We find that we have an Episcopalian Catholic worker, and a Lutheran Catholic worker, and a Jewish Catholic worker, and we have homosexual Catholic workers, and we have Catholic workers who aren't really religious at all, and they don't like to go to Mass with the rest of us. And so after a while, we wonder what it means to be a Catholic worker. But, we aren't all that monolithic, I think. We try to understand others, and your grandfather picked up ideas not only from the Americans, but from Christians like C.F. Andrews, and from the Muslims and so forth. But he really was raised as a Hindu, and I don't understand, but from the outside, as I understand it, Hindus emphasize the worship of God, and we all worship the same God, and there are avatars in every religion and so forth. Other religions look at it differently, that these bodies are real and we're supposed to build the kingdom of God on earth and all, and it's not really all that different. I think your grandfather would agree with that. But he was steeped in the Bhagavad Gita, and this gentleman just mentioned something else. He was very much a Hindu in his tradition, and we're very steeped in our tradition. It's a way of thinking and a way of prayer and spirituality and so forth. And there's a great universality about it, so that the great mystics all resonate on the same level. But we can't help but come from where we come from, and being who we are, and we find nourishment in that. So I just put that out there. I'd like your response, but I want to ask you, I really had a question coming into this, as you know, which is, I wonder also if you could comment, did you ever see your grandfather working with constructive program, maybe advising people and so forth in these different areas of living a nonviolent life?
All the time, people came and asked him to resolve some problems or something, and he also advised people who went out into the society and to do constructive work, what and how they should do it. So he was involved in all of that at the same time. So he was, doing several things at the same time there. And many of the leaders of the movement at the time used to get exasperated with him and said, why are you focusing on so many different things when all of that can happen after we get independence? And he said, no, these are just as important as independence, and this has to go along simultaneously. And so he was involved in many different things. But he was, he liked the Bhagavad Gita, and he liked the Ramayana. But he never, in his work, brought his religion. In all the work that you'll see, he never mentioned that he's doing it because he's a Hindu, or that his work for India's independence was a Hindu movement. He never did. In fact, he said, a friendly study of all the scriptures is the sacred duty of every individual. And he made that friendly study. And he emphasized the word friendly, because we make critical studies all the time, but we never make a friendly study. So he made that friendly study. He read the Old Testament and the New Testament and the Quran and the Bhagavad Gita and all of them. And he came to the conclusion that none of them had the whole truth. All of them have a little bit of the truth, And we hang on to that little bit of truth thinking that that is the whole truth, and therefore we have a very distorted vision of our religion. But he said that if we all can learn from each other and take what is good from each of them, we enhance our own religion by doing that. So, you know, the Bhagavad Gita, what really inspired him in that is his own interpretation of that book. I don't know if any of you have read the Bhagavad Gita, but it's basically about a war between good people and bad people. And when one of the princes of the good people looks at the other side and he says, I can't fight this war because all my relatives and friends are on the other side there, and I can't kill them. And that is when Lord Krishna tells him that it is his duty to do it. Now the widely accepted interpretation of that is justifying war. Everybody says, look, Lord Krishna also justified war. You got to kill all the bad people and we'll have a world full of good people. But grandfather's interpretation of that was that the poet who wrote the book took poetic license to depict the conflict that we all have in our minds between the good and bad. That conflict is depicted in terms of a war. So it's our mental conflict and the war that goes on in our mind to determine what is right and what is wrong, what is good and what is bad. And generally we will find that when it appears, you know, when we have to deal with our own relatives or our own friends, we have a different justice system for them. Even though we know that they have done something very wrong or bad, we are not willing to you know, take harsh measures against them. So these are the things that inspired him, and you know, he felt very kind of he felt inspired by it.
Thank you. Just to follow up a little bit with that thought, there's a scholar at the Catholic Worker, he's retired now, Michael True, who wrote a book called Truth, a Force, an Energy Field